The fluorescent lights of the Brazos County Sheriff's Department hummed with that particular frequency that made Detective Maria Castellanos' temples throb. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in March 2024, and she'd been staring at the same manila folder for 3 hours, the coffee in her mug long since gone cold. The folder was thin, remarkably thin for a case that had haunted this department for 28 years. Inside were photographs that had yellowed at the edges, witness statements typed on an actual typewriter, and a single evidence bag containing a silver charm bracelet with half its charms missing. The case file read, Brooklyn Rivera, missing, July 14, 1996. Maria had seen the billboard on Highway 6 1,000 times, Brooklyn's senior portrait smile frozen in time, her dark curls catching sunlight that no longer existed, the word missing in block letters that had faded from red to a sun-bleached pink. Everyone in Brazos County knew that billboard. It had become part of the landscape, like the water tower or the First Baptist Church steeple. After a while, people stopped seeing it. After a while, Brooklyn became a ghost story that mothers told their daughters about stranger danger, about being careful, about how quickly everything could change. But Maria saw it. Every single day on her drive to work, she saw it. She'd been 7 years old in 1996, living 2 streets over from the Riveras and the modest neighborhood of Southwood. She remembered the search parties, the way her own mother had gripped her hand tighter at the grocery store, the candlelight vigils that had illuminated the local park with a sea of flickering flames. She remembered Brooklyn's mother, Carmen, walking the streets with flyers, her voice growing hoarser each day as she called her daughter's name into the Texas heat. The door to the conference room swung open, and Sheriff Tom Drucker walked in, followed by 2 men Maria didn't recognize. One was tall and lean, wearing an FBI jacket despite the warmth of the March evening. The other was shorter, rounder, with the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades carrying secrets. "Detective Castellanos?" Sheriff Drucker said, and something in his voice made Maria stand up straighter. "This is Special Agent Marcus Webb from the FBI's Cold Case Unit and Dr. Richard Howell, forensic genealogist. They've been working on something big." Agent Webb set the laptop on the table, the modern technology looking absurdly out of place next to the ancient case file. "We ran the DNA from the crime scene through the genealogy databases," he said without preamble. "We got a hit, a solid hit." Maria's heart began to hammer. After 28 years? "The technology's evolved," Dr. Howell said softly, pulling out a chair. His hands were gentle with the case file, as if he understood it was more than just paper and ink. "We can now trace family connections through public DNA databases, people who submitted their genetic information for ancestry testing. We built a family tree backward from those connections." "Who?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff's face had gone gray. "That's the problem, Maria. That's why we're here at midnight. The DNA match led us to someone we never suspected, someone who's been part of this community the whole time." Agent Webb turned the laptop screen toward her. Maria saw a name, a photograph, an address she recognized. The room tilted slightly, and she gripped the edge of the table. "No," she breathed, "that's not possible." But even as she said it, fragments of memory began clicking together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The man in the photograph looked back at her with kind eyes, the same eyes that had looked out from newspaper articles about community service, from church bulletins, from the Brazos County newsletter where he'd been named Citizen of the Year in 2003. "We have a warrant," Sheriff Drucker said. "We're executing it at dawn. I need you on this, Maria. I know it's personal. Hell, it's personal for everyone in this county. But you're the best detective we have." Maria looked down at Brooklyn's photograph again. The girl had been 17, the same age her own daughter was now. She'd been planning to attend Texas A&M in the fall, wanted to study veterinary medicine because she loved animals more than people, her mother had told reporters. She'd been wearing a white sundress the day she disappeared, walking home from her summer job at the public library. 3 blocks. Just 3 blocks between the library and her house, and somewhere in those 3 blocks, Brooklyn Rivera had vanished from the world. Until now. "I'm in," Maria said. The rest of the night passed in a blur of preparation. They assembled a tactical team, coordinated with the district attorney's office, prepared for every possible scenario. Maria read through the case file again, this time seeing it through new eyes. The witness who'd seen a man talking to Brooklyn near the corner of Ridge Road and Palmer Street. The description: white male, 30s, average height, wearing a baseball cap. The detail that seemed meaningless at the time. The witness had said the man seemed to know Brooklyn, that they'd been talking like friends, not strangers. He was already part of her world, Maria murmured to herself as the sky outside began to lighten from black to deep blue. At 5:30 a.m., they rolled out in a convoy of unmarked vehicles. The address was in Cottonwood Estates, one of the nicer neighborhoods in Bryan, where the houses had 2-car garages and swimming pools and magnolia trees in the front yards. Maria's hands were steady on the steering wheel, but inside, her thoughts were chaos. She'd been to this house before. They all had. For community meetings, for fundraisers, for the annual 4th of July barbecue that had become a tradition. The house belonged to Thomas Whitmore, age 63, retired high school guidance counselor and youth pastor. Married to Patricia Whitmore for 41 years. 2 grown children, 5 grandchildren. Volunteer coordinator for the Brazos County Food Bank. Member of the Rotary Club. The man who'd helped organize the search parties for Brooklyn Rivera in 1996, who'd counseled Carmen Rivera through her grief, who'd set up the scholarship fund in Brooklyn's name. The perfect citizen. The last person anyone would suspect. The sun was just breaking over the horizon when they surrounded the house. Maria could see lights on inside. Someone was awake. She thought of Patricia Whitmore, probably making coffee, probably wondering why her husband hadn't come to bed, if he'd stayed up late again working on his model trains in the garage. Patricia had always been kind to Maria, had brought casseroles when Maria's father died, had asked about her daughter's soccer games. Sheriff Drucker gave the signal. They moved in synchronized precision, the battering ram unnecessary because Thomas Whitmore opened the door before they could knock, as if he'd been expecting them, as if, after 28 years, he was almost relieved. He was wearing a cardigan sweater and reading glasses, a mug of coffee in one hand. Behind him, Maria could see the comfortable interior of the house, family photographs on the walls, a cross-stitch sampler that read, "Blessed Beyond Measure," a piano in the corner with sheet music open to a hymn. "Mr. Whitmore," Agent Webb said, "we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance and murder of Brooklyn Rivera." For a moment, Thomas Whitmore just stood there, and Maria saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise, not denial, something worse, a kind of weary acceptance, as if a weight he'd been carrying for nearly 3 decades had finally become too heavy. "I'd like to speak with my wife first," he said quietly. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir." Behind him, Patricia Whitmore appeared in the hallway, her robe tied tightly around her waist, her hair still in curlers. She looked from her husband to the officers to the guns, and her face went through every stage of comprehension in seconds. "Tom? Tom, what is happening?" That was when Maria saw Thomas Whitmore's mask finally slip. His eyes filled with tears, and he looked at his wife with such naked desperation that Maria had to look away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "Patty, I'm so sorry. For everything." "Thomas Whitmore, you're under arrest for the murder of Brooklyn Rivera," Agent Webb continued. pulling out handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." Patricia Whitmore's scream tore through the quiet morning like a physical thing. Neighbors began emerging onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. Maria watched as Thomas was led to the patrol car, his head down, his shoulders shaking. She watched as Patricia collapsed against the doorframe, as their daughter, summoned by the noise, came running up the driveway still in her pajamas, confusion and horror written across her face. And Maria thought about Brooklyn Rivera, 17 years old forever, her senior portrait smile watching over Highway 6. And she wondered how many times Thomas Whitmore had driven past that billboard over the years. Had he felt guilt? Had he felt anything at all? Or had he simply gone about his life, teaching students, counseling the lost, standing in church on Sunday singing about grace and redemption while Brooklyn's bones lay hidden somewhere, waiting to be found? The morning sun climbed higher, painting the street gold, and Maria knew that nothing in Brazos County would ever be the same again. Brooklyn Rivera had been born on a February morning in 1979 during an ice storm that shut down most of central Texas for 3 days. Her mother, Carmen, liked to say that Brooklyn came into the world demanding attention, her cry louder than the ice pellets hitting the hospital windows. From the beginning, she was a force, opinionated, passionate, impossibly stubborn. Maria had spent the last 2 days doing what detectives do when a cold case suddenly becomes hot. She immersed herself in Brooklyn's world, or at least the world that remained preserved in police reports, school records, diary entries, and the memories of those who'd loved her. Carmen Rivera still lived in the same house on Meadowbrook Drive, a small ranch-style home with a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. The house had weathered 28 years of Texas sun and rain, and so had Carmen. She was 69 now, her dark hair gone silver, her hands gnarled with arthritis. But when Maria sat across from her in the living room that smelled of cinnamon and old paper, her eyes were still sharp, still fierce with a mother's love that death couldn't diminish. "Tell me about Brooklyn," Maria said gently. "Not the girl in the police reports, the real Brooklyn." Carmen smiled, and for a moment the weight of decades lifted from her face. "She was loud," she said. "God, that girl was loud. From the moment she woke up until she went to bed, she was talking, singing, arguing, laughing. My husband, Ernesto, he died in 2010. He used to call her our little mockingbird. She'd practice her speech team presentations in the shower, debate herself while doing dishes. The house felt alive when Brooklyn was in it. She reached for a photo album on the coffee table, its cover worn from years of handling. Inside, Maria saw Brooklyn at every age. Gap-toothed at 6, awkward at 12 with braces, and 2 long limbs, radiant at 15, with her quinceañera dress flowing around her like a cloud. She wanted to save every animal in the world, Carmen continued, turning pages. When she was 8, she found a bird with a broken wing in our backyard. She kept it in a shoebox by her bed, fed it with an eyedropper every 2 hours, even during the night. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. and hear her singing to it, soft little lullabies. The bird died anyway. I think it was too injured, and Brooklyn cried for a week. But that's when she decided. She said, "Mama, when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor for animals, so I can fix the ones that are broken." Maria felt a lump in her throat. She'd read the transcript of Carmen's original police interview, where she'd described Brooklyn's dreams with the same words, the same passion. 28 years, and the grief was still fresh. She'd gotten accepted to Texas A&M, Carmen said. Full scholarship. She was supposed to start that August in the pre-veterinary program. We were so proud. She was the first in our family to go to college. Ernesto worked double shifts at the plant to save money for her dorm room, even though the scholarship covered it. He wanted her to have spending money, to not worry about anything except studying. The album showed Brooklyn at her high school graduation, just 1 month before she disappeared. Her smile was incandescent, her cap slightly askew, her arms around two friends Maria recognized from the case files, Jessica Tran and Melissa Cordova. "I should talk to them," Maria said, making a mental note. "Jessica became a teacher," Carmen offered. "She's at Stephen F. Austin High School now. Melissa moved away, California, I think, but she still sends me Christmas cards. Every year, the same message, still thinking of Brooklyn, still hoping for answers. Now, finally, there are answers. But Tom Whitmore, Maria? I don't understand. He helped us. He organized the search parties. He prayed with us." Maria had been dreading this conversation, but there was no gentle way to say it. "That's often how it works, Mrs. Rivera. The perpetrator inserts themselves into the investigation. It gives them a sense of control, lets them monitor what the police know, and, in some cases, there's a psychological component, a desire to be close to the victim's family, to the grief. It feeds something in them." Carmen's hands clenched the photo album so hard her knuckles went white. "He watched me cry. He held my hand and told me to have faith that Brooklyn was with God now, and all that time?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Maria leaned forward. "I need to understand Brooklyn's routine that summer. The investigation focused on her walk home from the library, but I want to know everything, her whole day, every day." Carmen nodded, seeming to gather herself. "She worked at the public library 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, from noon to 5 p.m. She was in the children's section mostly, reading to kids during story hour, reshelving books. She loved it there. Miss Patterson was the head librarian. She's retired now, but she always said Brooklyn had a natural way with children." "What about when she wasn't working?" "She volunteered at the animal shelter on Wednesdays and weekends, Hope Haven, on Grosbeck Highway. It's still there, actually. She'd spend hours there, walking dogs, socializing the cats, cleaning cages. She never complained, even about the dirty work. She said every animal deserved kindness, especially the ones nobody wanted." Maria wrote down the details, but her mind was already working through the timeline. July 14th, 1996 had been a Sunday. Brooklyn hadn't been working at the library. So why had she been there? As if reading her thoughts, Carmen said, "She'd gone to return a book. It was overdue. She had checked out James Herriot's Treasury for Children 2 weeks earlier and kept forgetting to bring it back. She was so responsible about everything else, but library books? A ghost of a smile. She'd walk out of the house that afternoon carrying the book. I remember because she was wearing her favorite dress, this white sundress with little yellow flowers. She'd bought it with her first paycheck. She said she'd be back in 20 minutes, 30 at most. She was going to stop and say hello to Miss Patterson, return the book, and come right home. We were supposed to make enchiladas for dinner." 28 years, and Carmen still remembered the menu. Did she seem worried about anything? Had she mentioned anyone bothering her? No. Nothing. That's what made it so impossible to understand. She was happy that summer. She had just graduated. She was excited about college. She had good friends. There was a boy she liked, Marcus Washington, nice kid from her chemistry class, but nothing serious. She was focused on her future. Maria made a note to track down Marcus Washington, though she suspected he had been thoroughly investigated in 1996. The boyfriend or love interest was always the first suspect, but according to the file, Marcus had been at basketball camp in San Antonio the week Brooklyn disappeared, with dozens of witnesses and a coach who could account for every minute of his time. "Thomas Whitmore," Carmen said suddenly, her voice hard. "Did he know her? From church?" "We're still investigating the connection," Maria said carefully. "But yes, they attended the same church, First United Methodist on South College Ave." "Brooklyn sang in the youth choir," Carmen said, her eyes widening with realization. "Tom was one of the advisors. He chaperoned the trips, the retreats. Oh God, he was at our house. He came here after she disappeared, brought food, sat right where you're sitting, and told me not to give up hope. He looked me in the eyes and lied." The anger in her voice was volcanic. Decades of grief suddenly finding a target. Maria understood. She'd seen it before. The way families move from the agony of not knowing to the agony of knowing, and how sometimes the second was worse because it meant confronting the randomness of evil, the way it could wear a familiar face and speak in a kind voice. They talked for 2 more hours, and with each story, Brooklyn became more real to Maria. She learned that Brooklyn had been afraid of thunderstorms but loved rain, that she collected porcelain horses and arranged them on her windowsill in order of size, that she taught herself to play guitar by watching YouTube videos on her friend's computer. This was 1996, when the internet was still dial-up and precious. She learned that Brooklyn had wanted to travel to Australia someday to work with kangaroos, that she'd been terrible at math but brilliant at English, that she could quote entire passages from Charlotte's Web from memory. She had this thing she used to say, Carmen remembered, staring at a photo of Brooklyn holding a golden retriever puppy at the animal shelter. Whenever someone was mean to her or things went wrong, she'd say, "The world is hard enough. We should make it softer." She was 17 years old, and she understood something most adults never learn. Maria left the Rivera house with a stack of photocopied diary pages Carmen had given her permission to read, along with several photo albums to scan. As she drove through the old neighborhood, she saw how little had changed. The same modest homes, the same cracked sidewalks, the same live oak trees that had provided shade in 1996 and still did now. She parked at the corner of Ridge Road and Palmer Street, the last place Brooklyn had been seen alive. It was just an intersection, nothing special about it. A stop sign, a storm drain, a fire hydrant painted yellow. But standing there, Maria could imagine Brooklyn walking this route, could see her in that white sundress with yellow flowers, carrying a library book, maybe humming to herself. The library was 3 blocks north. The Rivera house was 3 blocks south. 6 blocks total, a 10-minute walk. Somewhere in that 10 minutes, Brooklyn had encountered Thomas Whitmore. Maria drove to the library next, a squat brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Inside, the smell of old paper and air conditioning hit her immediately. The current librarian was a woman in her 30s who looked confused when Maria showed her badge, but she directed her to the archives where records from 1996 were stored. It took an hour of searching through checkout cards and staff logs, but Maria finally found what she was looking for. Brooklyn Rivera had returned James Herriot's treasury for children at 2:47 p.m. on July 14, 1996. The card was stamped by Margaret Patterson, the head librarian Carmen had mentioned. The book had been 16 days overdue. Maria sat back in the uncomfortable archive room chair and closed her eyes, building the timeline in her mind. Brooklyn had left her house around 2:30 p.m., walked to the library, returned the book, and then what? The witness had placed her at Ridge Road and Palmer Street at approximately 3 p.m., talking to a man. That intersection was between the library and her house, so she'd been walking home, but she'd been talking to someone. Someone she knew enough to stop and have a conversation with on a July afternoon when she'd promised her mother she'd be home in 30 minutes. Thomas Whitmore had been 35 years old in 1996, a guidance counselor at Bryan High School. Summer vacation. He would have had free time. And according to Carmen, he'd been involved with the church youth group, which meant he would have known Brooklyn, would have been a familiar face, someone she'd trust. Maria's phone buzzed. A text from Sheriff Drucker. Interview scheduled for tomorrow, 9 a.m. Whitmore's lawyer is playing hardball, but we've got him cold on the DNA. How's it going on your end? She typed back, building the picture. She was extraordinary. That's what makes this so much worse. The next morning, Maria met with Jessica Tran at a coffee shop near the high school where she taught. Jessica was 39 now, with streaks of gray in her black hair and worry lines around her eyes. When Maria showed her badge and explained why she wanted to talk, Jessica's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "You found him? After all this time?" She whispered. "We did. I can't share details yet, but yes, I wanted to talk to you about Brooklyn. You were her best friend, according to the reports." Jessica nodded slowly, setting down her cup.
We've been friends since 6th grade. We were on speech team together, spent every weekend at each other's houses. After she disappeared, it broke something in me. I became obsessed with true crime, with missing persons cases. I think part of me thought if I studied enough cases, I'd figure out what happened to Brooklyn, that I'd find some clue everyone else missed. Tell me about her. And Jessica did. She painted a picture of a friendship that was intense and pure, the kind that only exists in adolescence when every emotion is amplified. She talked about how Brooklyn had stayed up all night with her when her parents were getting a divorce, how Brooklyn had convinced her to try out for the school play even though Jessica was terrified of performing, and how they'd had a secret language of inside jokes and movie quotes that nobody else understood. She was fearless, not in a reckless way, but in this moral way, like she'd stand up to anyone if she thought they were being cruel. There was this boy in our grade, Danny something, who used to pick on kids with disabilities. Brooklyn confronted him in the cafeteria in front of everyone. She said, "You think you're tough because you make fun of people who can't defend themselves? That doesn't make you tough. It makes you a coward." Danny never bothered anyone again after that. Was she seeing anyone romantically?
She liked Marcus Washington, but it was casual. They went to prom together, kissed a few times. She wasn't really interested in serious dating. She said she had too much to do, too many plans. She wanted to get through college first, establish her career. She used to joke that she'd probably marry some Australian veterinarian and spend her life rescuing koalas. Jessica's voice cracked on the last word, and Maria gave her a moment. The day she disappeared, Maria prompted gently, "Did you talk to her?" "We talked that morning, on the phone. She called me around 10, asked if I wanted to go to the movies that night. There was some romantic comedy playing. I can't even remember which one now. I said yes, and we agreed to meet at 7. She said she had to return a library book first, then she'd be free." That was the last time I heard her voice. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Brooklyn and Jessica at their high school graduation, arms around each other, faces bright with joy and possibility. "I carry this everywhere," Jessica said. "For 28 years I've carried it, and I think about how she never got to be a veterinarian, never got to save those koalas, never got to be more than 17. Someone stole all those years from her, from all of us." Maria's next interview was with Hope Haven Animal Shelter Director Michael Santos, who'd been a young volunteer coordinator in 1996. He was 52 now, balding with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades caring for animals and the people who loved them. "Brooklyn was special," he said simply, leading Maria through the shelter where dogs barked and cats watched from behind glass enclosures. "We get a lot of volunteers who come in excited and then quit after a week because the work is hard and sometimes heartbreaking. Brooklyn never quit. She worked here from April through July of 1996, and she came in every single week without fail. Even when it was 100 degrees outside and the air conditioning was broken, even when she was sick with a cold, she showed up." He stopped in front of a memorial wall Maria hadn't noticed before. Among the plaques commemorating longtime supporters and beloved animals was a photograph of Brooklyn kneeling next to a German shepherd, both of them grinning at the camera. "That's Shadow," he said softly. "He was a rescue from an abuse situation. Terrified of people, aggressive, unadoptable according to everyone except Brooklyn. She spent hours with him, just sitting in his kennel, reading to him, not asking for anything. It took 6 weeks, but eventually he let her touch him. Eventually he trusted her. She found him a home with a retired veteran who had experience with traumatized dogs. Last I heard, Shadow lived another 12 years, happy and loved." "Did she seem worried about anything that July? Did she mention anyone making her uncomfortable?" Michael thought about it, his eyes distant with memory. "No, nothing like that. She was excited mostly, talking about college, about her classes. She'd registered for Introduction to Animal Biology and was thrilled. But..." He hesitated. "But what?" There was one thing. About a week before she disappeared, she came in really quiet. Not upset, just thoughtful. I asked if everything was okay, and she said something strange. She said, "Is it wrong to know something about someone that would hurt other people if you told?" I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and said, "Never mind." I figured it was teenage drama, a friend's secret or something. I didn't push it. Maria's instincts sharpened. "She didn't give you any more details?" "No, and honestly, I forgot about it until just now. But looking back, I wonder, maybe she knew something. Maybe that's why—" He couldn't finish. Maria made extensive notes, her mind racing. Had Brooklyn discovered something about Thomas Whitmore? Had she confronted him? Was that why she'd stopped to talk to him that day on Ridge Road? Not a random encounter, but something planned, something deliberate? She spent the afternoon at the First United Methodist Church, talking to Pastor Reverend Elizabeth Kim, who'd taken over the congregation in 2005, but had access to records from 1996. The youth group roster confirmed what Carmen had said. Brooklyn had been an active member, attending Wednesday night meetings, Sunday services, and monthly retreats. Thomas Whitmore's name appeared on almost every sign-in sheet as a chaperone or advisor. He was very involved, Reverend Kim said, her voice heavy with shock. According to these records, he volunteered 15 to 20 hours a week with our youth programs. He led Bible study, organized mission trips, counseled troubled teens. Everyone trusted him. Did your predecessor mention anything unusual about him? Pastor Reynolds passed away in 2018, but I've read through his files. There's nothing. Thomas Whitmore was considered a pillar of this church, a model Christian. His arrest has devastated our congregation. People are struggling to reconcile the man they knew with what he's accused of. That evening, Maria sat in her home office surrounded by case files, photos, diary entries, and her own handwritten notes. Her daughter, Sophia, knocked on the door around 9 o'clock. "Mom, you've been in here for hours. Did you eat dinner?" Maria looked up, seeing her 17-year-old daughter, the same age Brooklyn had been, and felt her chest tighten. "I had coffee." "Coffee isn't dinner." Sophia came in carrying a sandwich and a glass of water, setting them on Maria's desk with the exasperated care of a teenager used to looking after her distracted mother. She glanced at the photographs spread across the desk, and her expression shifted. "Is that the girl from the billboard? The one who's been missing since forever?"
Her name was Brooklyn Rivera, and we found him, Sophia. We found the man who killed her. Sophia sat down in the spare chair, suddenly looking much older than 17. Was she like me? In some ways. She wanted to be a veterinarian. You want to be a marine biologist. Both of you love animals more than people. Mom, that's not true. I like some people. It was a weak joke, but Maria appreciated the effort. She was walking home from the library, 3 blocks, in broad daylight, and she trusted the wrong person. Is that why you always make me text you when I get somewhere, even if it's just Kayla's house down the street? Yes. Sophia was quiet for a moment, studying Brooklyn's graduation photo. She looks happy here. She was. She had everything ahead of her. And someone just took it. Because he could. Yes. Sophia stood up, kissed her mother's forehead. I'm glad you found him, Mom. I'm glad someone finally did. Now eat your sandwich. You can't solve crimes on coffee alone. After Sophia left, Maria picked up Brooklyn's diary, photocopied pages that Carmen had entrusted to her investigation. The entries were typical of a 17-year-old. Excitement about graduation, anxiety about college, friendship drama, movie reviews, sketches of animals in the margins. But as Maria read deeper, she found something that made her breath catch. An entry from July 7th, 1996, 1 week before Brooklyn disappeared. I don't know what to do. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now I can't stop thinking about it. If I tell, it will destroy a family. If I don't tell, I'm protecting someone who doesn't deserve protection. Why do adults make everything so complicated? I need to pray about this. I need to figure out what's right. Maybe I should talk to Pastor Reynolds, but what if he doesn't believe me? What if nobody believes me? I wish I'd never gone to the church that day. I wish I didn't know. Maria read the entry 3 more times, her detective's mind cataloging every word. Brooklyn knew something. She discovered something about Whitmore, and I think that's why he killed her. She reached for her phone and called Sheriff Drucker. "I need to be in that interview tomorrow," she said, without preamble. "I found something. Brooklyn knew. She discovered something about Whitmore, and I think that's why he killed her." "We interview at 9, Drucker confirmed. "Bring everything you've got." Maria worked through the night, building a profile, a timeline, a case that went beyond DNA evidence into motive and opportunity and the terrible logic of murder. By the time the sun rose on what would be the most important interview of her career, Maria understood Brooklyn Rivera not just as a victim, but as a whole person, brave, compassionate, idealistic, and ultimately betrayed by the very goodness that had defined her. "The world is hard enough," Brooklyn had said. "We should make it softer." Instead, the world had been unbearably hard to her. But now, finally, there would be justice. The interrogation room at the Brazos County Sheriff's Department smelled of industrial cleaner and fear. Maria had been in this room hundreds of times, but today felt different. Today, they weren't just questioning a suspect. They were interrogating a man who'd hidden in plain sight for 28 years, who'd worn the mask of respectability so convincingly that an entire community had celebrated him while a 17-year-old girl's bones lay waiting to be found. Thomas Whitmore sat across from her in an orange jumpsuit, his hands folded on the metal table. His lawyer, Richard Pemberton, was a sharp-faced man from Houston who'd driven in overnight and looked like he'd slept in his Mercedes. Beside Maria sat Agent Webb and Sheriff Drucker, while a video camera in the corner documented everything. Whitmore looked smaller than he had in his house. The kindly guidance counselor persona had crumbled, revealing something hollower beneath. His eyes, which had seemed so warm in every photograph Maria had seen, now darted between the 3 investigators with the trapped wariness of a cornered animal. "My client wishes to make a statement," Pemberton began, but Whitmore cut him off. "I want to talk," he said, his voice raspy. "I've wanted to talk for 28 years." Pemberton's objection died in his throat. Every defense attorney's nightmare, a client who wanted to confess. "Tom, I strongly advise—" "I'm done with advice, Richard. I'm done with all of it." Whitmore turned to Maria, and there was something almost pleading in his gaze. "You're Carmen's friend, aren't you? I've seen you at her house." "I'm Detective Castellanos, and I'm here to find out what happened to Brooklyn Rivera." Brooklyn. He said her name like a prayer, like a curse. She was supposed to save animals. Did you know that? She was going to be a veterinarian. She told me all about it during youth group. She had this whole plan. College, then veterinary school, then maybe work with wildlife rehabilitation. She was so full of plans. "What happened to her, Mr. Whitmore?" He was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt her. You have to understand that. I never meant for any of it to happen." Agent Webb leaned forward. "Why don't you tell us what did happen? Start from the beginning." And Thomas Whitmore began to talk. He told them about July 14th, 1996, a Sunday afternoon when the temperature had climbed to 98 degrees and the church had emptied after the morning service. He'd stayed behind to work in his office, preparing materials for an upcoming youth retreat. Around 2:30 p.m., he'd decided to drive home, taking his usual route down College Avenue toward Cottonwood Estates. I saw her walking, Whitmore said, his voice mechanical now, as if reciting from a script he'd rehearsed in his mind for decades. Brooklyn. She was on Ridge Road, carrying a book. I recognized her immediately. She'd been in my office at the high school several times that spring, talking about college applications. I pulled over to say hello. Maria watched him carefully. The DNA evidence placed him at the scene. They'd found his genetic material on Brooklyn's bracelet, the one that had been ripped from her wrist and recovered 2 days after her disappearance in a drainage ditch near Palmer Street. But DNA couldn't tell them the story. Only Whitmore could do that. She seemed nervous when I stopped. I asked if she needed a ride. It was hot and she was sweating. She said no at first. Then she said we needed to talk, that she'd been trying to decide whether to come see me. Talk about what? Maria asked, though she already knew. Brooklyn's diary entry burned in her mind. Whitmore's facade cracked then, and something desperate flickered across his face. About what she'd seen. The previous Sunday, after church, she'd forgotten her Bible in the sanctuary. She came back for it around 4 o'clock. And he swallowed hard. She saw me with Rachel Morrison. The name meant nothing to Maria at first, but Sheriff Drucker inhaled sharply. Rachel Morrison? Jim Morrison's wife? Yes. Whitmore's voice was barely audible now. Maria made the connection instantly. Jim Morrison had been the church treasurer in 1996, a prominent businessman in the community. His wife Rachel had been involved in every church committee, every fundraiser. Maria pulled out her phone and quickly searched the name. Rachel Morrison had died in 1998, just 2 years after Brooklyn's disappearance. Car accident on Highway 21, late at night, drove off the road into a ravine. The obituary called it a tragedy. What did Brooklyn see? Maria pressed. She saw me kissing in my office. Rachel and I had been having an affair for 6 months. My wife didn't know. Rachel's husband didn't know. Nobody knew. And this 17-year-old girl walked in and saw everything. Pemberton put his head in his hands, knowing his client was building a confession that would destroy any hope of a defense. But Whitmore couldn't stop now. The dam had broken. Brooklyn was horrified, not judgmental, just sad, disappointed. She looked at me like I'd betrayed her, which I suppose I had. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, you counsel people about morality. You lead Bible study. And you're doing this?" I tried to explain, as if there was any explanation, but she just shook her head and left. And that day, July 14th, when you saw her on the street, she got in my car, said she'd been praying about what to do, that she'd decided I needed to confess to my wife and to Rachel's husband, that keeping the secret was eating her up inside. She said, "The truth hurts, but lies hurt worse. You have to make this right." Maria could hear Brooklyn's voice in those words, the earnest idealism of a girl who believed the world should be fair, who thought truth and justice naturally aligned. I panicked. Whitmore continued, his words coming faster now. All I could think was that my marriage would be over, my job would be gone, my reputation destroyed. Rachel would be devastated. Her husband was violent when he drank, and she was terrified of him finding out. I begged Brooklyn to reconsider, to give me time. But she was adamant. She said she was going to talk to Pastor Reynolds the next day. "So you killed her?" Agent Webb's voice was flat, factual. "I didn't plan it. I swear I didn't plan it. I was driving, trying to convince her to wait, and she said she was getting out. She reached for the door handle, and I grabbed her arm. She struggled. Her bracelet cut on something, the door lock maybe, and broke. Charms scattered everywhere, and then—" He stopped, his breathing ragged. The room was absolutely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet whir of the video camera. "Then what, Mr. Whitmore?" Maria's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I didn't mean to hurt her so badly. She hit her head on the dashboard when I grabbed her, hard. There was blood, and she wasn't moving. And I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I pulled off onto a service road, one of those old farm roads that nobody uses anymore. I checked her pulse.
She was still alive, but she was unconscious.
Maria felt sick. Brooklyn had been alive. There had been a chance to save her, to call for help, to do anything except what came next. "I should have called 911, Whitmore said, and now tears were streaming down his face. "I should have taken her to the hospital, but all I could think was that if she woke up, she'd tell everyone what happened. She'd tell about the affair, about how I'd grabbed her. My life would be over, so He couldn't finish. "You what?" Sheriff Drucker demanded, his voice shaking with fury. I held my hand over her nose and mouth. She was already barely breathing. It only took a few minutes, and then she was gone. And there was no taking it back. The confession hung in the air like poison. Maria thought of Carmen Rivera, waiting 28 years to know what happened to her daughter. And the answer was this. Brooklyn had died because she'd wanted to do the right thing, because she'd believed in truth and integrity, because she'd trusted that an adult, a guidance counselor, a youth pastor would ultimately make the moral choice. Instead, Thomas Whitmore had chosen himself. "Where is she?" Maria asked, her voice barely controlled. "Where did you put her body?" Whitmore gave them coordinates, a location in the Brazos River Valley on property that had belonged to his wife's family, an old hunting cabin that had been abandoned for decades. He'd buried Brooklyn under the floorboards, then burned the cabin down months later, claiming it was an electrical fire. The insurance payout had helped fund his children's college education. "I want to show you," he said desperately. "I want to take you there. I want to bring her home to her mother. That's all I want now." Pemberton tried one last time. "Tom, stop talking. Please stop talking." But Whitmore ignored him, turning to Maria with something like hope in his eyes. "I've thought about her every single day for 28 years. Every single day. When my grandchildren were born, I thought about how Brooklyn would never have children. When I celebrated my 40th wedding anniversary, I thought about how she never even made it to her 18th birthday. The guilt has been eating me alive." "Yet, you did nothing," Agent Webb observed coldly. "You organized search parties. You counseled her grieving mother. You established a scholarship in her name. And all the while, you knew exactly where she was." I wanted to confess so many times. I almost did, dozens of times. But I was a coward. I chose my comfort over her justice. I chose my reputation over the truth. And Rachel, God, Rachel, she never knew what I'd done. She died thinking we'd gotten away with our secret. She died not knowing that our affair had cost a girl her life. Maria stood abruptly, unable to sit in the same room with him any longer. "We'll verify your confession. If the remains are where you say they are, if the forensic evidence matches your story, then you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, and that still won't be enough justice for what you took from Brooklyn Rivera and her family." As they prepared to leave the interview room, Whitmore called out one last time, "Tell Carmen I'm sorry. Please, tell her I'm sorry." Maria turned back, her eyes blazing. "You don't get to ask for her forgiveness. You don't get to feel better by apologizing. You stole her daughter, and then you stole 28 years of closure. Your sorry means nothing." The excavation began 3 days later. Maria stood at the perimeter of what had once been the Whitmore family hunting cabin, now nothing but a foundation covered in weeds and the remnants of charred wood. A forensic team worked methodically, using ground-penetrating radar first, then carefully removing layers of earth and debris. Carmen Rivera insisted on being there, despite Maria's attempts to convince her otherwise. "I waited 28 years, Carmen said firmly. "I'll wait a few more hours to bring my baby home." The local news stations had set up outside the police perimeter, their cameras trained on the site. By noon, the national outlets had arrived. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all running variations of the same story. Cold case solved after nearly 3 decades. Respected community leader confesses to teen's murder. Pastor Reverend Kim stood with Carmen, providing quiet support. Jessica Tran had driven in from Houston. Even Michael Santos from Hope Haven had closed the shelter for the afternoon to be present.
They formed a circle of grief around the excavation site, bearing witness. It was 2:47 p.m. when the forensic anthropologist, Dr. Nina Reeves, carefully brushed away a final layer of earth and debris and revealed what they'd been searching for. Bones, small and fragile, arranged in a position that suggested hasty burial. Beside them, scraps of fabric, white with faded yellow flowers, a sundress that had survived when its owner had not. Carmen's knees buckled, and Pastor Kim caught her. The sound that came from Carmen's throat was primal, a mother's grief given voice after being held silent for almost 3 decades. Maria turned away, wiping at her eyes, and found herself face to face with Thomas Whitmore's wife, Patricia. She'd arrived unnoticed, standing at the edge of the scene with the destroyed expression of a woman whose entire life had been revealed as a lie. "I didn't know," Patricia whispered, though Maria had not asked. "How is that possible? How could I not know?"
"Because he was good at hiding," Maria said, not unkindly. "Because people like him learn to compartmentalize. They create separate versions of themselves. The loving husband, the devoted community member, the killer, and they keep those versions from touching. My children won't speak to me," Patricia continued, her voice hollow. "They think I must have known, must have suspected. Our grandchildren." She couldn't finish. Maria understood that there were multiple victims in cases like this. Brooklyn was the primary victim, of course, her life stolen, her potential erased. But there were secondary victims, too. The families destroyed by the truth, the communities shattered by betrayal, the innocents who carried guilt they didn't earn. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're not responsible for your husband's choices. The only person responsible for Brooklyn's death is Thomas." Patricia nodded mechanically, but Maria could see she didn't believe it. She'd carry this guilt for the rest of her life, wondering what signs she'd missed, what conversations she'd misread, what moments of distance she'd dismissed. By evening, Brooklyn Rivera's remains had been carefully extracted and transported to the medical examiner's office. The preliminary findings confirmed Whitmore's story: trauma consistent with a blow to the head, evidence of asphyxiation. Brooklyn had been 17 years old when she died, 5 foot 3 inches tall, approximately 120 pounds. She'd been wearing a white sundress, white sneakers, and a silver bracelet that was now in police custody as evidence. The news conference was held at 7 p.m. with Sheriff Drucker standing at a podium surrounded by microphones. Maria stood to his left, Agent Webb to his right. Behind them, enlarged photographs of Brooklyn, smiling at her graduation, holding a puppy at the animal shelter, singing in the church choir. "After 28 years of investigation," Sheriff Drucker began, "we can confirm that Brooklyn Rivera was murdered on July 14, 1996 by Thomas Lawrence Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore has confessed to the crime and led investigators to the location of Brooklyn's remains. He will be charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with physical evidence." The questions came rapid fire. What was the motive? Brooklyn had discovered information about Mr. Whitmore that he wanted to keep secret. When she indicated she would reveal this information, he killed her to prevent exposure. What information? "We're not releasing those details at this time out of respect for other parties involved." "How did you solve the case after so long?" Agent Webb stepped forward. "Advances in forensic genealogy allowed us to match DNA from the crime scene to Mr. Whitmore's family tree. This technology wasn't available in 1996, but recent developments have made it possible to solve cold cases that were previously unsolvable. What do you say to the community that trusted Thomas Whitmore?" Sheriff Drucker's expression hardened. "I say that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor, your teacher, your pastor. Thomas Whitmore betrayed this entire community's trust. He helped search for a girl he'd killed. He comforted a mother whose grief he'd caused. That level of deception is almost incomprehensible, but it's real. And it's a reminder that we must always prioritize truth and justice over reputation and comfort. Maria added, Brooklyn Rivera was an extraordinary young woman who died because she believed in doing the right thing. She saw corruption and wanted to expose it. She valued truth over convenience, and that moral courage cost her everything. We should honor her memory by being equally committed to truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. The conference ended, but the media storm was just beginning. Over the next 72 hours, investigative journalists descended on Brazos County, interviewing anyone who'd known Thomas Whitmore or Brooklyn Rivera. Old yearbooks were digitized and scoured for clues. The affair with Rachel Morrison became public despite Maria's attempts to keep it confidential, and Jim Morrison, now 74 and living in a nursing home, gave a rambling interview about how his wife had been corrupted by that man. The church convened an emergency meeting to discuss removing Thomas Whitmore's name from every plaque, every award, every corner of the building where his presence lingered. The scholarship fund, established in Brooklyn's name, received an influx of donations, over $200,000 in the first week alone, as people tried to transform their horror and guilt into something productive. But the most difficult conversations were happening in private, in living rooms across Brazos County where people questioned everything they'd believed. If Thomas Whitmore could be a murderer, who else might be hiding darkness behind a friendly face? If a guidance counselor and youth pastor could kill a girl and then help search for her, what other monsters might be lurking in positions of trust? Maria attended a town hall meeting at the community center, where over 300 people gathered to process the collective trauma. The anger was palpable. Anger at Whitmore, anger at themselves for not seeing, anger at a system that had failed Brooklyn. "How many times did we see that man?" an elderly woman asked, standing up from the crowd. "How many times did we shake his hand, eat his food, trust him with our children? I had Thomas Whitmore counsel my grandson when he was struggling in school, my grandson, and all the while—" "We couldn't have known," Pastor Kim tried to offer. "He fooled everyone."
But should we have known? A man countered. Were there signs we ignored because he was respectable, because he was white, because he held positions of authority? Would we have been more suspicious if he'd been different, if he'd been an outsider? It was an uncomfortable question, and the room fell silent. Maria recognized the truth in it, the way society afforded certain people the benefit of the doubt while viewing others with automatic suspicion. Thomas Whitmore had benefited from every privilege imaginable: race, class, education, community standing. Those privileges had allowed him to hide in plain sight for 28 years. Jessica Tran stood up, her voice shaking but determined. Brooklyn would want us to learn from this. She believed in truth even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. So we need to ask ourselves, who else aren't we seeing? What other truths are we avoiding because they're uncomfortable? Brooklyn died trying to expose one lie. Let's honor her by being willing to face all lies, no matter who tells them. The applause that followed was fierce and cathartic. In the midst of the public reckoning, Maria continued building the prosecution's case. She interviewed 23 people who'd known Thomas Whitmore, documenting the pattern of manipulation and control that had gone unnoticed for decades. She found former students who'd felt uncomfortable around him but couldn't articulate why. She found colleagues who'd noticed how he always volunteered to be alone with teenage girls during counseling sessions. She found church members who remembered that he'd been overly interested in the details of Brooklyn's case, always asking investigators what they'd found, what leads they were pursuing. The pattern was clear to Maria now. Thomas Whitmore had been monitoring the investigation to ensure his safety. Every kind gesture, every prayer vigil, every shoulder to cry on had been calculated to keep him above suspicion while simultaneously feeding his need to remain close to the crime.
Dr. Sandra Okoye, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case, explained it to Maria over coffee one afternoon. It's not uncommon for offenders to insert themselves into the investigation. There's a psychological component, a need to relive the crime, to feel powerful by watching the police fail to catch them, to experience the grief they've caused as a form of twisted connection to the victim. In Whitmore's case, his role as a respected community member allowed him to do this openly without raising suspicion. He got to play the hero, Maria said bitterly. He got to be the compassionate counselor helping the poor Rivera family while all along he was the reason they were suffering. Exactly. And that duality, the ability to harm someone and then comfort those harmed, requires a profound lack of empathy. It requires seeing other people not as fully human, but as props in the story of your own life. Maria thought about Brooklyn's diary entry. The world is hard enough, we should make it softer. How had she encountered Thomas Whitmore's hardness and responded with softness? How had she tried to do the right thing, even knowing it would cause pain? The answer was simple. Brooklyn was better than the world deserved, and the world killed her for it. 1 week after the discovery of Brooklyn's remains, Maria received a phone call from an unexpected source. Rachel Morrison's sister, Diane Fletcher. She lived in Colorado now, hadn't been back to Texas in years, but the news coverage had reached her. "I need to tell you something," Diane said, her voice tight with decades of suppressed knowledge. "About my sister's death, the car accident. It wasn't an accident." Maria's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Rachel called me the night before she died. She was drunk, crying, barely coherent. She said she knew what Thomas had done. She said she'd found evidence. I don't know what kind, she wouldn't tell me, that connected him to Brooklyn's disappearance. She said she was going to turn him in, that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. The next morning, she was dead. Single car accident on a clear night on a road she'd driven 1,000 times. Did you tell the police?" "I tried, but I was the hysterical sister, making wild accusations without proof. Thomas came to the funeral, comforted me, told me that Rachel had been struggling with depression. Everyone believed him. I was the only one who thought. But I couldn't prove anything, so I left Texas and tried to forget." Maria's mind was racing. Did Rachel ever mention what the evidence was? "She said it was something from that day, something she'd kept. But she was so drunk I couldn't get details. If there was evidence, I don't know what happened to it." After the call ended, Maria pulled Rachel Morrison's accident file. The investigating officer had noted that Rachel had a blood alcohol content of 0.14, well above the legal limit. Her car had left the road at approximately 11 p.m. on a Thursday night in September 1998, 2 years and 2 months after Brooklyn's disappearance. There were no witnesses, no skid marks suggesting evasive action, no apparent reason for the crash except driver impairment. But Maria had learned long ago that coincidences in murder cases were rarely coincidental. She requested a full review of Rachel Morrison's death, knowing it would take time, but convinced there was more to the story. Had Thomas Whitmore killed Rachel too, staging it to look like an accident? Had Rachel's guilt over the affair and her knowledge of what that affair had caused driven her to confront him? The questions multiplied like shadows, each answer revealing new darkness.
By the end of the 3rd week, formal charges had been filed against Thomas Whitmore. The grand jury had returned indictments on multiple counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and, after further investigation, involuntary manslaughter in the death of Rachel Morrison. The prosecution had found a witness who'd seen Whitmore's truck near the location of Rachel's accident that night, and phone records showed 3 calls between them in the hours before she died. Thomas Whitmore would face trial for destroying 2 lives, though everyone involved knew the true count was much higher. Carmen Rivera would never get her daughter back. Patricia Whitmore would carry the stain of her husband's crimes. The community would never fully trust itself again. But Brooklyn Rivera would finally have justice. The trial of Thomas Lawrence Whitmore began on a cold January morning in 2025, 6 months after his arrest. The Brazos County Courthouse was built in 1893, a grand limestone structure with sweeping stairs and columns that suggested justice was a timeless, unchanging force. But Maria knew better. Justice was messy, imperfect, delivered by flawed humans trying their best in a flawed system. The courtroom was packed. Carmen Rivera sat in the front row, flanked by Jessica Tran and Pastor Kim. Behind them, dozens of Brooklyn's former classmates, now in their mid-40s, had taken time off work to attend. The media filled the gallery, cameras positioned to capture every moment for the evening news. And scattered throughout were the curious, people who'd known Thomas Whitmore, people who wanted to understand how a murderer had hidden among them for so long. Judge Patricia Nguyen, a 62-year-old Vietnamese-American woman with a reputation for running a tight courtroom, entered at precisely 9 a.m. Everyone stood. Maria took her seat behind the prosecution table, where District Attorney Robert Chen shuffled his meticulously organized papers. Thomas Whitmore entered in handcuffs, wearing a gray suit his wife had brought to the jail but refused to visit him in. He'd aged dramatically in 6 months, his hair completely white now, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like what he was, a man who'd carried a terrible secret for 28 years and finally collapsed under its weight. The jury had been selected over 2 painstaking weeks, 12 people who'd lived in Brazos County long enough to remember Brooklyn's disappearance, but hadn't been directly connected to the case. 8 women, 4 men, ranging in age from 23 to 71. Maria had studied each of them during voir dire, looking for the ones who could handle the weight of this decision. D.A. Chen's opening statement was precise and devastating. He walked the jury through Brooklyn's last day using enlarged photographs and a timeline projected on screens. He showed them the diary entry about the affair, the church records placing Whitmore and Brooklyn in the same spaces, the DNA evidence that proved Whitmore's physical contact with Brooklyn on the day she died. The defense will try to paint this as a tragic accident, D.A. Chen said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. They'll tell you Thomas Whitmore never meant to hurt Brooklyn Rivera, that it was a moment of panic, that he suffered enough. But I want you to remember one crucial fact. After Brooklyn was unconscious, after she hit her head and stopped fighting, Thomas Whitmore had a choice. He could have called 911. He could have taken her to the hospital. Instead, he chose to suffocate a 17-year-old girl to death, and then he chose to hide her body and lie about it for 28 years. Those weren't accidents. Those were choices, and those choices make him guilty of first-degree murder. The defense attorney, Richard Pemberton, gave an opening statement that focused on Whitmore's previously unblemished record, his decades of community service, his cooperation with police after arrest. My client made a terrible mistake. He panicked in a moment of crisis, and that panic led to tragedy. But the law recognizes degrees of culpability, and we will show that this was not premeditated murder, but rather a series of bad decisions made by a man in extreme psychological distress. Maria kept her expression neutral, but inside she was furious. A series of bad decisions didn't cover 28 years of deception, didn't account for the search parties Whitmore had organized while knowing exactly where Brooklyn's body lay, didn't explain the scholarship fund he had established to burnish his reputation as a caring community member. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. D.A. Chen called 42 witnesses, building a comprehensive picture of both victim and perpetrator. Carmen Rivera testified first, her voice steady despite the tears that rolled down her cheeks. She described Brooklyn's dreams, her kindness, the last conversation they'd had about making enchiladas for dinner.
My daughter was the best person I knew. She tried to do the right thing, and you killed her for it. You didn't just take her life. You took everything she would have been, everyone she would have helped, all the good she would have done in this world." Whitmore looked down at the defense table, unable to meet her eyes. Jessica Tran testified about their friendship, about Brooklyn's moral conviction. She couldn't stand injustice. Even small injustices bothered her. "When I complained about someone spreading rumors about me in 10th grade, Brooklyn confronted that person directly. She said, 'Words have power. You don't get to hurt people just because it's fun.' That was who she was. She believed people should be held accountable." Marcus Washington, Brooklyn's prom date, now a high school basketball coach in Dallas, was 46 years old, married with 3 kids. But when he talked about Brooklyn, he became 17 again.
"I was at basketball camp when she died," Marcus said, his voice thick. "I found out 3 days later when my mom picked me up. I remember I couldn't breathe. I kept thinking it was a mistake, that it couldn't be real. Brooklyn was supposed to meet me at the movies the night she disappeared. We were going to see some comedy. I can't even remember which one now. But I remember thinking, if I'd just been there, if I hadn't gone to camp, maybe I could have protected her." "Mr. Washington," D.A. Chen said gently, "you couldn't have known what would happen. But I've spent 28 years wondering if she suffered, if she was scared, if she called out for help and nobody came. And now I know the answer. She did call out. She asked Thomas Whitmore to do the right thing. And instead of helping her, he killed her." The forensic evidence was presented with clinical precision. Dr. Nina Reeves, the forensic anthropologist, explained how Brooklyn's remains had been identified through dental records and DNA. Dr. James Morrison, no relation to Rachel Morrison, walked the jury through the autopsy findings. Blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with impact against a hard surface, damage to the hyoid bone, indicating asphyxiation, evidence that death had occurred 6 to 8 hours after the last meal Brooklyn had eaten. She was alive for some time after the initial trauma, Dr. Morrison testified. The injuries to her head were serious but not immediately fatal. With medical intervention, she would likely have survived. That revelation caused an audible gasp in the courtroom. Brooklyn could have been saved. Whitmore had chosen not to save her. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Dr. Richard Howell, the forensic genealogist, explained how he'd built Whitmore's family tree using publicly available genetic databases, then narrowed down to Whitmore himself through traditional detective work. The DNA found on Brooklyn's bracelet matched Thomas Whitmore with a probability of 99.99997%, Dr. Howell testified. There is no reasonable doubt about the source of that genetic material. But the most damaging testimony came from Thomas Whitmore himself. Against his attorney's strenuous objections, Whitmore insisted on testifying. "I need to tell the truth," he said when Pemberton tried one last time to talk him out of it. "I've been lying for 28 years. I'm done lying." On the stand, Whitmore recounted the entire story. The affair with Rachel Morrison, Brooklyn's discovery of it, and the confrontation in his car. His voice cracked when he described holding his hand over Brooklyn's mouth and nose. "I could feel her trying to breathe," he said, staring at his hands as if seeing blood on them that only he could see. "I could feel her lungs struggling. And I kept thinking, just a little longer, and the problem goes away. That's what I reduced her to in my mind, a problem to be solved. Not a person, not a girl with dreams and a family and a future. Just an obstacle between me and the life I wanted." "Mr. Washington," D.A. Chen said during cross-examination, "you said you panicked, but you had multiple opportunities to change course. When Brooklyn was unconscious, you could have called an ambulance. When you pulled onto that service road, you could have driven to a hospital. Even after you'd moved her body, you could have reported what happened. Why didn't you?" "Because I'm a coward," he said simply. "Because every step of the way I chose my comfort over her life. I chose my reputation over her justice, and I've had to live with that every single day. Yet you continued to present yourself as a pillar of the community. You counseled other teenagers. You stood beside Brooklyn's mother and pretended to share her grief. How could you do that?" Whitmore looked at Carmen Rivera for the first time since the trial began. "I told myself I was doing penance, that by helping other kids, by being there for Carmen, I was somehow making up for what I'd done. But that was just another lie. The truth is I was feeding off the grief. It made me feel important, needed, and it kept me close enough to the investigation to make sure I never got caught." The courtroom was silent, except for Carmen's quiet weeping. "Mr. Whitmore, did you also kill Rachel Morrison?" Pemberton jumped to his feet. "Objection! My client has not been convicted of that charge." "I'll allow it," Judge Nguyen said. "The witness may answer." Whitmore took a shaky breath. "Rachel called me the night before she died. She was drunk, hysterical. She said she'd found Brooklyn's library card in my car. I'd forgotten about it, didn't even know it was there. She said she'd kept it for 2 years, too afraid to turn it in but too guilty to throw it away. That night, she told me she couldn't live with the secret anymore. She was going to the police in the morning." This is a sprawling story about Brooklyn Rivera, a compassionate 17-year-old from Brazos County, Texas, who disappeared in July 1996 and whose case remained unsolved for 28 years until advances in forensic genealogy and persistent investigation finally brought her killer to justice. Brooklyn was a bright, kind-hearted teenager who volunteered at Hope Haven Animal Shelter, rehabilitating traumatized animals with remarkable patience and skill. She had been accepted to Texas A&M's veterinary program and lived by a simple philosophy: the world is hard enough, make it softer. On July 14, 1996, she left the local library where she worked and was never seen alive again. Her disappearance devastated her mother Carmen and close friends Jessica Tran, Marcus Washington, and Michael Santos. The initial investigation, led by Sheriff Bob Drucker, found Brooklyn's car abandoned with her keys, wallet, and a silver bracelet still inside, suggesting foul play. Despite extensive searches and a billboard her mother maintained for decades, no trace of Brooklyn was found. The case went cold, though Carmen never stopped pushing for answers.
In 2024, Detective Maria Castellanos reopened the case using forensic genealogy on DNA evidence preserved from Brooklyn's car. This led to Thomas Whitmore, a respected 61-year-old church music director and community leader who'd actually helped organize search parties for Brooklyn. When confronted with the evidence, Whitmore confessed to murdering Brooklyn after she discovered his affair with Rachel Morrison, the wife of his business partner. Brooklyn had found Rachel's library card in Whitmore's car and confronted him about the affair, threatening to expose it to protect Rachel's husband Jim, who was Brooklyn's friend Michael's father. Whitmore lured Brooklyn to a remote property under the pretense of explaining, then strangled her and buried her body. The confession revealed a second murder. Whitmore had also killed Rachel Morrison in 1998 when she found evidence linking him to Brooklyn's disappearance and threatened to go to the police. He sabotaged her car's brakes, causing a fatal crash that was ruled an accident for 26 years. At trial, Whitmore pleaded guilty and testified in graphic detail about both murders, describing how he'd maintained his respectable facade for decades while knowing exactly where Brooklyn was buried. He participated in memorial services, counseled grieving families, and established a scholarship in Brooklyn's name, all while concealing his crimes. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder of Brooklyn Rivera and involuntary manslaughter of Rachel Morrison, and Judge Noon sentenced him to life in prison without parole.
The story then traces the profound impact of Brooklyn's case and the eventual justice over the following decades. Carmen buried her daughter properly and spent her remaining years ensuring Brooklyn's legacy endured. The community underwent significant transformation. Churches implemented stronger youth protection policies. The Sheriff's Department established a cold case unit under Maria's direction that solved 147 additional cases. And the Brooklyn Rivera Center for Victim Advocacy was founded to help families of cold case victims. Brooklyn's philosophy of making the world softer became a movement. Scholarships were awarded in her name to veterinary students, including Maria's daughter Sophia, who dedicated her career to animal-assisted therapy. Animal shelters across the country saw increased volunteerism inspired by Brooklyn's story. Cold case investigation techniques improved dramatically, with forensic genealogy becoming standard practice. Youth protection policies strengthened nationwide after revelations about how Whitmore's position of authority had provided access to vulnerable teenagers. Even Thomas Whitmore's own daughter, Teresa, started a podcast examining how family members cope when loved ones commit terrible crimes, helping others process similar betrayals. His wife Patricia, after years of isolation and guilt, found purpose volunteering at domestic violence shelters, helping women betrayed by men they trusted. The narrative follows these ripples of change across multiple generations. 30 years after Brooklyn's death, the Brooklyn Rivera Reading Garden opened at the library where she worked. 60 years later, a documentary examined how her case had transformed victim advocacy, forensic science, and youth protection policies. 100 years after her birth, a statue was erected, showing Brooklyn holding a puppy, her face turned toward the sky with hope and determination. Throughout these decades, thousands of people were named Brooklyn in her honor. Detectives were inspired to solve cold cases. Students pursued careers in criminal justice, veterinary medicine, and victim advocacy because of her story. Parents taught their children about courage and truth-telling using her example. Animal shelter volunteers stayed late remembering her dedication. Teachers paid closer attention to quiet students. Communities prioritized truth over reputation and safety over comfort. Thomas Whitmore died in prison in 2043 at age 82, largely alone and forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave. His name became merely a cautionary tale about the banality of evil, how monsters can hide behind respectability, and how evil can masquerade as goodness for decades. Meanwhile, Brooklyn's grave never lacked fresh flowers. The oak tree above it grew massive, providing shelter and shade. Visitors came constantly. Families who found closure through cold case breakthroughs made in Brooklyn's name. Students heading to exams seeking inspiration. Children named Brooklyn meeting the girl they were named after. Detectives drawing courage for difficult investigations. The story's power lies in its central truth, that Thomas Whitmore, in trying to silence Brooklyn by killing her and hiding her body, actually amplified her voice beyond anything she could have achieved in life. Her 17 years of choosing kindness, helping wounded creatures, and standing up for truth inspired millions of people across generations to make similar choices. Every detective who worked harder on a cold case, every volunteer who stayed late at an animal shelter, every person who spoke truth to power, every parent who taught their child about moral courage, all were carrying forward Brooklyn's light. The narrative concludes with a scene 100 years after Brooklyn's birth. A young boy touching her statue and declaring his intention to make the world softer too. His mother guides him away, and Brooklyn's bronze eyes seem to follow them, blessing their choice to choose goodness over darkness, light over shadow. The final observation captures the story's essential message, that the world was unbearably, fatally hard to Brooklyn Rivera, and because of her brief life authentically lived and her death transformed into meaning through her mother's determination and her community's commitment to change, millions learned to make it softer. That transformation of individual tragedy into collective purpose, the narrative suggests, is what justice truly looks like. Not merely punishment for perpetrators, but the multiplication of the goodness they tried to destroy. Brooklyn Rivera was a 17-year-old from Brazos County, Texas, who embodied compassion and moral courage. Born during an ice storm in 1979, she was described by her mother, Carmen, as loud, passionate, and impossibly stubborn, a force of nature that made every space feel alive. Brooklyn worked at the public library's children's section and volunteered at Hope Haven Animal Shelter, where she patiently rehabilitated traumatized animals that others deemed unadoptable. She had been accepted to Texas A&M's pre-veterinary program on full scholarship and lived by a guiding philosophy: the world is hard enough, we should make it softer.
On July 14, 1996, Brooklyn left home in her favorite white sundress with yellow flowers to return an overdue library book, James Herriot's Treasury for Children. She told her mother Carmen she'd be back in 30 minutes. They were going to make enchiladas for dinner. It was a 10-minute walk, just 6 blocks total. She never came home. A witness saw Brooklyn at Ridge Road and Palmer Street around 3 p.m., talking to a man who seemed to know her. They appeared to be conversing like friends, not strangers. Days later, her silver charm bracelet was found in a drainage ditch, half its charms missing. Despite extensive searches, candlelight vigils, and a billboard Carmen maintained for 28 years on Highway 6, Brooklyn simply vanished. The investigation initially focused on her routine, working at the library Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, volunteering at the animal shelter on Wednesdays and weekends, singing in the youth choir at First United Methodist Church. Her boyfriend Marcus Washington was at basketball camp in San Antonio with airtight alibis. There were no obvious suspects, no apparent enemies. Brooklyn was happy that summer, excited about college, focused on her future. Thomas Whitmore was everything Brazos County admired. A 35-year-old high school guidance counselor, youth pastor at First United Methodist, volunteer coordinator for the food bank, Rotary Club member. He helped organize search parties for Brooklyn. He counseled Carmen through her grief. He established a scholarship fund in Brooklyn's name. In 2003, he was named Citizen of the Year. For 28 years, Whitmore lived a double life. He married Patricia for 41 years, raised 2 children, welcomed 5 grandchildren, attended church every Sunday singing hymns about grace and redemption. He counseled troubled teenagers, led Bible studies, organized mission trips. Everyone trusted him. He was the perfect citizen and the last person anyone would suspect. But Whitmore was monitoring the investigation the entire time, inserting himself to feel powerful, to relive his crime, to ensure he never got caught. Every kind gesture was calculated. Every prayer vigil fed something dark within him. And all the while, Brooklyn's bones lay buried under his family's hunting cabin in the Brazos River Valley. Detective Maria Castellanos had been 7 years old in 1996, living 2 streets from the Riveras. She remembered the search parties, her mother gripping her hand tighter at stores, the community's collective trauma. Now, with a 17-year-old daughter of her own, the same age Brooklyn had been, Maria reopened the cold case. Advances in forensic genealogy changed everything. DNA from Brooklyn's bracelet was run through public ancestry databases, building a family tree backward through genetic connections. On a Thursday night in March 2024 at 11:47 p.m., FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb and forensic genealogist Dr. Richard Howell showed Maria the match, Thomas Whitmore. At dawn, they executed the arrest warrant. Whitmore opened the door before they could knock, as if he'd been expecting them, as if, after 28 years, he was almost relieved. Behind him, Patricia appeared in curlers and robe, her face cycling through comprehension in seconds. Whitmore's mask finally slipped. "I'm sorry," he told his wife. "Patty, I'm so sorry for everything." Patricia's scream tore through the quiet morning. Maria immersed herself in Brooklyn's world through police reports, diary entries, photo albums, and interviews with those who'd loved her. Carmen described Brooklyn's dream of saving animals, how at 8 years old she'd fed an injured bird every 2 hours through the night, singing lullabies. Best friend Jessica Tran recalled Brooklyn's fearless moral conviction, confronting bullies, standing up for the vulnerable, believing people should be held accountable.
Michael Santos from Hope Haven described how Brooklyn rehabilitated Shadow, an unadoptable German shepherd, through months of patient compassion. The key breakthrough came from Brooklyn's diary, dated July 7, 1996, 1 week before she disappeared. "I don't know what to do. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now I can't stop thinking about it. If I tell, it will destroy a family. If I don't tell, I'm protecting someone who doesn't deserve protection. I wish I'd never gone to the church that day. I wish I didn't know." Brooklyn had discovered something at the church, something serious enough that she struggled with whether to report it. Michael Santos remembered her asking a week before her death, "Is it wrong to know something about someone that would hurt other people if you told?" In the interrogation room, against his lawyer's desperate objections, Whitmore wanted to talk. He'd wanted to talk for 28 years. He told them about his 6-month affair with Rachel Morrison, wife of church treasurer Jim Morrison. On July 7, 1996, Brooklyn had forgotten her Bible after church and returned to find Whitmore and Rachel kissing in his office. Brooklyn was horrified, not judgmental, just sad and disappointed. She looked at him like he'd betrayed her, which he had. For a week, Brooklyn wrestled with what to do. On July 14th, when Whitmore saw her walking on Ridge Road, she got in his car and told him she'd decided he needed to confess to his wife and Rachel's husband. "The truth hurts, but lies hurt worse. You have to make this right." She planned to talk to Pastor Reynolds the next day. Whitmore panicked. His marriage, job, reputation, everything would be destroyed. Rachel's husband was violent when drunk. She was terrified of him finding out. Whitmore begged her to wait, but she was adamant. When she reached for the door handle, he grabbed her arm. Her bracelet broke, charms scattering. She hit her head hard on the dashboard. She was still alive, but she was unconscious, Whitmore confessed, tears streaming. "I should have called 911. I should have taken her to the hospital, but all I could think was that if she woke up, she'd tell everyone. My life would be over."
He drove to a remote service road. He checked her pulse. She was alive. Then he held his hand over her nose and mouth. I could feel her trying to breathe. I could feel her lungs struggling, and I kept thinking, just a little longer. That's what I reduced her to in my mind, a problem to be solved, not a person, not a girl with dreams and a family and a future. He buried Brooklyn under his family's abandoned hunting cabin, then burned the structure months later, claiming electrical fire. The insurance payout funded his children's college education. The confession revealed more darkness. Rachel Morrison died in 1998 in a single-car accident, drunk driving on a clear night on a familiar road. Her sister Diane Fletcher called Maria. Rachel had phoned the night before, drunk and hysterical, saying she'd found Brooklyn's library card in Whitmore's car and was going to police in the morning. The next day, Rachel was dead. Whitmore admitted to it. Rachel had kept the library card for 2 years, too afraid to turn it in, but too guilty to discard it. When she finally threatened to confess, Whitmore acted. Investigation found a witness who'd seen his truck near the accident site that night, plus phone records showing 3 calls between them in the hours before she died. Thomas Whitmore had killed 2 women to protect his secret, staging Rachel's death to look accidental for 26 years. 3 days after his confession, forensic teams excavated the hunting cabin site. Carmen insisted on being present despite Maria's protests. "I waited 28 years. I'll wait a few more hours to bring my baby home." National media descended: CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. At 2:47 p.m., forensic anthropologist Dr. Nina Reeves revealed bones, small and fragile, beside scraps of white fabric with faded yellow flowers, a sundress that survived when its owner did not. Carmen's knees buckled. The sound from her throat was primal, a mother's grief finally given voice after 28 years of silence. Patricia Whitmore appeared at the perimeter, destroyed. 41 years of marriage revealed as a lie. Her children wouldn't speak to her, convinced she must have known. Maria tried to help. "You're not responsible for your husband's choices. The only person responsible is Thomas." But Patricia would carry that guilt forever.
The trial began in January 2025 at the Grand 1893 Brazos County Courthouse. The courtroom overflowed. Carmen in front with Jessica and Pastor Kim, dozens of Brooklyn's former classmates now in their mid-40s, media documenting everything. District Attorney Robert Chen's case was devastating. 42 witnesses over 3 weeks building a comprehensive picture of victim and perpetrator. Carmen testified about Brooklyn's dreams and character. Jessica described her moral courage. Marcus Washington, now a basketball coach with 3 kids, became 17 again, talking about losing Brooklyn. Forensic evidence proved Brooklyn could have survived the head injury with medical intervention. Whitmore deliberately chose murder over accountability. The DNA match was 99.99997% certain. Against his attorney's strenuous objections, Whitmore insisted on testifying. He recounted everything in graphic detail: the affair, Brooklyn's discovery, the killing, the 28 years of deception. He admitted to feeding off the grief to feel important and powerful while monitoring the investigation. On Rachel Morrison's death, "I could have let her go to police. I could have confessed. Instead, I killed her too." D.A. Chen's cross-examination was surgical. "You had multiple opportunities to save Brooklyn. You chose your comfort over her life. You chose your reputation over her justice. Then you organized search parties for a girl you'd killed. You counseled her grieving mother. You established a scholarship in her name. How could you do that?" "I told myself I was doing penance, but that was just another lie. The truth is I was feeding off the grief, and it kept me close enough to the investigation to make sure I never got caught." The jury convicted him of first-degree murder of Brooklyn Rivera and involuntary manslaughter of Rachel Morrison. Judge Patricia Nguyen sentenced him to life without parole. When Thomas Whitmore asked Maria to tell Carmen he was sorry, Maria's response was steel. "You don't get to ask for her forgiveness. You don't get to feel better by apologizing. You stole her daughter, and then you stole 28 years of closure. Your sorry means nothing." The conviction sparked profound community transformation. The church removed Whitmore's name from every plaque and award. The scholarship fund received over $200,000 in donations within a week. But the deeper work was harder. People questioned everything they'd believed. At a town hall with over 300 attendees, an elderly woman stood up. "How many times did we shake his hand, eat his food, trust him with our children? I had Thomas Whitmore counsel my grandson." A man asked the uncomfortable question: were there signs we ignored because he was respectable, because he was white, because he held positions of authority? Would we have been more suspicious if he'd been different, if he'd been an outsider? The silence was heavy. Maria recognized the truth. Thomas Whitmore had benefited from every privilege imaginable. Those privileges allowed him to hide in plain sight for 28 years. Jessica Tran stood up, voice shaking but determined. Brooklyn would want us to learn from this. She believed in truth even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. So we need to ask ourselves, who else aren't we seeing? What other truths are we avoiding because they're uncomfortable? Brooklyn died trying to expose one lie. Let's honor her by being willing to face all lies, no matter who tells them.
The applause was fierce and cathartic. Brooklyn Rivera's death catalyzed change that rippled across decades. The Sheriff's Department established a cold case unit under Maria's direction, solving 147 additional cases. The Brooklyn Rivera Center for Victim Advocacy was founded. Churches implemented stronger youth protection policies. Forensic genealogy became standard practice nationwide. Brooklyn's philosophy, "The world is hard enough, we should make it softer," became a movement. Thousands of children were named Brooklyn in her honor. Students pursued careers in criminal justice, veterinary medicine, and victim advocacy because of her story. Animal shelters saw increased volunteerism. Parents taught moral courage using her example. Even Whitmore's own daughter, Teresa, started a podcast helping families process betrayal by loved ones who commit crimes. His wife, Patricia, eventually found purpose volunteering at domestic violence shelters. Carmen spent her remaining years ensuring Brooklyn's legacy endured. The Brooklyn Rivera Reading Garden opened at the library. Scholarships were awarded to veterinary students, including Maria's daughter Sophia, who dedicated her career to animal-assisted therapy inspired by Brooklyn's compassion for wounded creatures. Story's power lies in its deepest irony. Thomas Whitmore tried to silence Brooklyn by killing her and hiding her body, but he actually amplified her voice beyond anything she could have achieved in life. Her 17 years of choosing kindness, helping wounded creatures, and standing up for truth inspired millions across generations. Every detective who worked harder on a cold case, every volunteer who stayed late at an animal shelter, every person who spoke truth to power, every parent who taught their child about moral courage, all carried forward Brooklyn's light. Thomas Whitmore died in prison in 2043 at age 82, largely alone and forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave. His name became merely a cautionary tale about the banality of evil, how monsters hide behind respectability. Meanwhile, Brooklyn's grave never lacked fresh flowers. Visitors came constantly. Families who found closure through cold case breakthroughs made in her name, students seeking inspiration, children named Brooklyn meeting the girl they were named after, detectives drawing courage for difficult investigations. 100 years after her birth, a statue was erected, showing Brooklyn holding a puppy, face turned toward the sky with hope and determination. A young boy touches it and declares his intention to make the world softer too. The final message? The world was unbearably, fatally hard to Brooklyn Rivera, but because of her brief life authentically lived and her death transformed into meaning through her mother's determination and her community's commitment to change, millions learned to make it softer. That transformation of individual tragedy into collective purpose is what justice truly looks like, not merely punishment for perpetrators, but the multiplication of the goodness they tried to destroy.
Subscribe for more value. Join our community and unlock exclusive benefits. By subscribing, you'll get instant access to premium content, early releases, and members-only features. Stay ahead with regular updates delivered straight to you. No more missing out on what matters most. Whether you're here for expert insights, entertainment, or inspiration, your subscription ensures you never miss a moment. Plus, you'll be supporting the content you love and helping us create even better experiences. It's simple, affordable, and packed with perks. Don't wait. Subscribe today and become part of something special. Your journey to enhanced access starts now.